Ba-na-na-na-na-na. Ba-na-na-na-na-na. Hi everyone and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you've just found this place, then welcome. And if you're returning, I'm glad to have you back. I'm Alex and this is my channel where we explore and theory craft different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Today we are doing another one of our quick builds where we'll be exploring a briefly summarized character build for D&D 5e. And as always with our quick builds, if there's ever a build you'd like to see me explore in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments below. The concept for today's build comes from BarnJake1, who asked for a Cyclops from X-Men character build. And since this is the official week when Deadpool and Wolverine hits theaters, I figured it would be a great time to put out this character build since I kind of missed the X-Men 97 release a few months ago, but of course back then I did watch it, got a lot of inspiration, and admittedly am excited to put out a Cyclops-based character build. Looking at the concept of how to build Cyclops, there is of course a bit of an elephant in the room that I should probably talk about, and that is Eldritch Blast. There are a lot of other builds out there for Cyclops, and of course a lot of people would expect him to sort of be an Eldritch Blast warlock, maybe with some monk levels thrown in, or fighter levels with unarmed fighting as well, and that is all well and good because honestly, it's a pretty accurate way to recreate Cyclops. Eldritch Blast can almost perfectly mimic his optic beams. His optic beams are meant to be more concussive in nature than actual lasers that burn things, as far as I can tell, which means that the most appropriate damage type for them, I believe, would be force damage. And the best way to get on-demand force damage is Eldritch Blast. The reason I'm mentioning this, though, is because that's actually not the route we're going to take. And the route I am going to take admittedly isn't going to get that really nice on-demand ranged force damage that can be the optic beams. We'll get other things that mimic our optic beams and can do some pretty powerful stuff, but we're just not going to have as nice of an on-demand feature that can mimic it. We're doing something slightly different, and we're also not just focused purely on his optic beams. We're also going to be trying to recreate the personality of Cyclops, the big blue Boy Scout, who is also the leader of the X-Men. Admittedly, the big blue Boy Scout part is probably going to come down just to roleplay, and the leadership elements actually could work with Warlock as an Eldritch Blaster because they can synergize with Charisma. They can synergize with some other stuff too, which is why we're going to pick them up and still be useful with them, even though we're not going Charisma at all. So what are we actually going to be taking for this character build? Well, let's answer that by starting off in character creation. For our lineage, we're going to go custom lineage. You can go human variant, and human variant is probably a little bit more appropriate since X-Men are mutants, which are literally variant humans, but I like custom lineage purely for the ability score increase. We get a free +2 to put where we want, and an extra free feat, which if we pick a half feat, means that we can get a total +3 to one of our scores, getting it to 18 right off the bat, and that's really what we want. If you wanted a more evenly distributed ability score stat line, then feel free to go human variant, get your 2 +1s, as well as the half feat. The half feat that we're going to be taking is Gift of the Gem Dragon from Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. This lets us improve our intelligence, wisdom, or charisma by 1 to a maximum of 20, and it also gives us telekinetic reprisal. Telekinetic reprisal says that whenever we take damage from a creature that is within 10 feet of us, we can use our reaction to emanate telekinetic energy. The creature that dealt that damage to us must make a strength save. On a failed save, they take 2d8 force damage and are pushed up to 10 feet away from us. On a success, they take half as much and aren't pushed. And we can use this reaction a number of times equal to our proficiency bonus, and of course gain all the uses back on a long rest. This is really great as it is our first Optic Blast. It is a more retaliate feature rather than an actual on-demand one to use on our turn, but given that we're already level 1, haven't even picked our class yet, and we now have a force damage dealing feature that can mimic our optic beams, that is great in my book. So now that we know what our half feat is, what is our actual stat line? Well, we're going to get the following ability scores. We're going to put 2 points into strength to get 10 strength, 7 points into dexterity and constitution to get 14 in each of those. We're going to put 9 points into intelligence as well as our 3 ability score increases in order to get that to 18. We're going to leave wisdom alone at 8, putting no points into it, and then our last 2 points are going to charisma to increase that to 10. These stats probably aren't super reflective of how Cyclops should feel in the actual comics, shows, media, anything like that, but it's really the best we can do with what we've got. I'm leaving strength a little lower than it probably should be. Scott is fairly ripped and in like peak physical condition, but I'm going to instead use Constitution to reflect that, since mechanically we don't really need strength for our build. The Charisma is a little bit lower, but we're getting other things that are going to reflect our leadership capabilities that actually don't need Charisma, so we're not too worried about that stat either. 8 Wisdom feels appropriate, since we do work with a guy who regularly hits on our girlfriend and we don't really do much about that, so, you know. And then 18 Intelligence, I think actually works really well for Scott/Cyclops, because Cyclops is supposed to be a very tactical thinker and strategic combatant. Finally, for our background, the background on this build actually does matter. If you can't take what we're going to pick up, then unfortunately we're not going to get as many leadership abilities as we want to, but any other background flavored well would work. The background we do want, though, is Knight of Solamnia. Knight of Solamnia is technically a Dragonlance specific setting background, which is why your DM may or may not say yes or no to it. But before they do, I would argue that it is very easy to reflavor for our character build. Being an X-Men, or just teacher at Professor X's institute, is very similar to being a knight in a knightly court. The themes of both the background of being a knight as well as being an X-Men fit very well together. So I am going to assume that because it is an easy enough background to reflavor for our character build, that we are going to get to take it. Also because we do want other feats that have Squire of Solamnia feat as a prerequisite. So picking up Squire of Solamnia with our background instead of actually dedicating an ability score or feat to it would be admittedly really optimal for us. So now that we know what our character creation is, what is our actual build and what are we going that requires intelligence? Well, admittedly, we're actually going to go Wizard of all things. Wizard is probably going to need some reflavoring done, some heavy reflavoring at that, to really make us feel like an X-Men. Because technically, the X-Men's power comes from the X gene. They don't learn their powers over time. So for us, we'll reflavor it as best we can. But as we level up, the idea of going further into Wizard is probably like us getting more training with our powers rather than just unlocking new spells. We're going to be doing a Wizard 16 and Fighter 4 split as well. So really quick, let's talk about Fighter first just to get it out of the way. I would probably start with Fighter for the saving throws in Constitution, as well as the extra proficiencies in armor and such things, but you don't have to if you don't want to. And really, if you do start Fighter, we're actually not going to pick up our real optic beams until level 3. That may be a lot later than you would like to have those Optic Blasts to be able to feel like Cyclops, and that's perfectly fair as well. If that's the case, start Wizard instead, go up to Wizard 2, then switch to Fighter after, and pick stuff up there. At Fighter, we're breaking it down where we're jumping in either at level 1 or level 3, and then we're not coming back to it until levels 8, 9, or 10, really. The reason is because we want right away second wind for some self-healing, as well as a fighting style that can reflect Cyclops' fighting style. Unarmed fighting for some punching or blind fighting to be able to fight when we don't have our visor. Both feel pretty thematic, so you could probably reasonably pick any fighting style that you felt was most appropriate. Then, later on, once we have a whole bunch of levels in Wizard, getting Action Surge is going to be great for some real burst turns. Fighter 3 lets us pick a subclass where we're going to pick Battle Master in order to get some extra leadership type features. And then finally, we're going to have an ability score improvement to end off our fighter levels with. We won't go higher than that because we don't need extra attack really, unless you want to do lots of attacking. Wizard, on the other hand, is where most of Cyclops' optic beams are going to come from. With Wizard, what we want to do is once we get to Wizard 2, take Scribe Wizard as our subclass. Scribe Wizard is going to let us use the Awakened Spellbook in order to swap damage types of spells. What it really lets us do is whenever we cast a wizard spell with a spell slot, we can temporarily replace the damage type of that spell for another one in our spellbook. Both spells basically have to be the exact same level when we're casting them. So for example, if we want to cast Burning Hands and swap the damage to Force, we need level 1 Magic Missile. If we want to cast something like Fireball, which we might want to do, but probably not, but if we did, we would need a 3rd level spell that deals force damage. And that is the entire gimmick of the build. We're going to be going up in through levels of Wizard, grabbing as many force damage spells as we can in order to switch other spells to be force damage. This means that roughly every time you get a new level of spell that you could cast, that's when we're going to pick up at least one spell that deals force damage, and then the other spells can be mostly whatever you want. We're primarily looking for ranged attack spells, line spells, or cone spells, things that can actually mimic our Optic Blasts. Once we have those, being able to swap those spells and their damage types to force damage can perfectly mimic those big optic beams, and arguably even better than Eldritch Blast. Eldritch Blast is more on demand, but having spells that feel like an optic beam and being able to switch them to force damage to really capture that idea can make us feel like we're shooting different beams at different degrees of intensity. Think about it. At level 3 as a wizard, you could pick up Agonizer Scorcher, which is just a straight line spell, or Scorching Ray as well, which is a multi-target ranged attack spell, and then you can also grab Spray of Cards to turn both of those spells into force damage. Those could be your go-to optic beams until you get 3rd level spells, where we could then pick up Lightning Bolt to do a much larger and more intense optic beam than we could previously. Not to mention that there are some times where Cyclops would rather do small little beams that maybe ricochet or just blast an enemy back, and then there are other times where he wants to go full force and unleash a massive blast that can take out a lot of enemies at once, one big enemy, you name it. To make a long story short, we're basically jumping back and forth for our first 10 levels from fighter to wizard, going up wizard until we get to at least level 5 or 6 where we get 3rd level spells, then go back to fighter. After we've picked up fighter 4, we're just going wizard for the rest of the build. So really quick, some key spells to give us that force damage at each level we're going to pick up are Magic Missile at level 1, Spray of Cards at level 2, Pulse Wave at level 3, Gravity Sinkhole at level 4, either Big B's Hand or Steel Wind Strike at level 5, Disintegrate at 6, Draconic Transformation at level 7, and Dark Star at level 8. All of those spells have force damage in their spell descriptions, which means that they can be switched for damage types from other spells. And they will let us fuel our actual spells that are either big lines, big cones, or powerful ranged attacks. And the last thing to mention is some cleanup on what our actual feats that we're taking are, as well as what maneuvers we want from Battlemaster, and how we're reflavoring some of the other features from Order of Scribes. First of all, for Order of Scribes, specifically the Manifest Mind feature, even though it feels really odd to have this awakened spellbook manifest a spectral mind in terms of being an X-Men, for us it can be reflavored really easily. We can just pretend that this is Jean, our girlfriend, wife, fiance, depending on where you are in the timeline. This could just be her creating a psionic projection to aid us in our combat, which I think is pretty funny. And then because you can cast spells through the manifested mind, it could arguably be a way to allow us to cast some more spells that don't feel like Cyclops would be able to cast, but maybe Jean could. Like, of course, a psychic damage fireball or something along those lines. Over to our Battlemaster maneuvers, these are kind of touch and go as to what you really want. I think I would like Commanding Presence, Tactical Assessment, and maybe one other tactical or command-like ability, but honestly it's totally up to you. The reason I picked those ones are because Commanding Presence and Tactical Assessment help our leader flavor while boosting our skill checks if we have to make those, but our main leadership features are coming from the Knight of the Rose and Knight of the Crown feats. We're going to pick these up with both of our first ability score increases, which is why I also wanted intelligence to be 18 right off the bat, because we're not increasing intelligence for quite a while. With these two feats though, they're both half feats, and they can both increase constitution. Then, once they do, they each give a different rally feature. Knight of the Rose gives bolstering rally, which is a bonus action that we can use to give temporary hit points equal to a d8 plus our proficiency bonus, plus our ability modifier that we increased with this feat, so Constitution. This can be a lot of inspirational rallies that we give out to our party members as a bonus action, and that doesn't require charisma either. That's really nice, especially since we don't really have a bonus action to use per se until maybe later levels. Knight of the Crown, of course, does a little more weaponizing by actually let us command our allies to attack. They have to use their reaction, but if they do, they get to add an extra d8 to the attack's damage roll. And once again, we can do this a number of times equal to our proficiency bonus and regain all uses on a long rest. And other than that, that's pretty much the build. Let's go through and summarize real quick what we have, because we kind of jumped all over the place and we didn't really look at what we are. We are a wizard fighter giving us more of the sort of tactical leadership elements, and then wizard reflects our actual X-Men powers, allowing us to get big optic beams that will always do force damage, as well as the potential aid from Jean. Our initial feats are dedicated to giving us a sort of leadership feel, like the big blue Boy Scout leader of the X-Men that we're supposed to be, and afterwards can just be dedicated to any feats that you would like, or improving your ability scores to just become more powerful of a character. The unfortunate thing is that we don't have a real on-demand cantrip or anything like that that deals force damage, like I talked about in the beginning of the video. Now the nice thing is that if you're okay with missing out on Eldritch Blast, but still wanted a type of on-demand optic beam recreation, we can actually pick up Swords Burst. Swords Burst is a cantrip that came along in Swords Coast Adventurer's Guide originally, alongside Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade, and those two cantrips are just a lot more popular, so I think Swords Burst usually gets overlooked. But Swords Burst deals force damage, so it can be easily reflavored to be a small optic beam. It'll hit every creature within 5 feet of us when we cast it, so it's like a mini AoE. But just in pure terms of recreating an on-demand optic beam, it's definitely the way to go for our specific build. Once we do get up to higher levels, I don't think missing out on Eldritch Blast is going to be that big of an issue, because we'll be casting more spells. And personally, I prefer the actual spells and changing their damage types to force damage to really make us feel like Cyclops using his powers in the best way possible. Other than that, that's pretty much the build. Let me know what you thought of it, or what you would add or change to get closer to Cyclops, or if you would even bother going Wizard or going a different route like Warlock or something with Eldritch Blast. And also let me know if you're excited for Deadpool and Wolverine, and if you think Cyclops will actually make an appearance in the movie. I still thought that this X-Men build was perfect around the same time that the movie was coming out. Thank you so much for coming on the journey with me, and I hope to see you in the next one.